Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be recapping Day 4 of the first round of the NHL playoffs. And starting off the day was the Avalanche versus the Coyotes. Obviously, the Avalanche had dominated completely Game 1. It looked like the Coyotes wouldn't really be able to compete in this series, but they came out here in Game 2. They played a prideful sort of game, and they managed to keep this one close. The first goal was scored by McKinnon just a few minutes in, after the Coyotes had actually had a pretty decent start the first couple of minutes. Then it would be tied up by Clayton Keller to make it 1-1. Tyson Jost would get the 2-1 lead and the 1-goal lead back for the Avalanche before tied up once again by Grabner. But then in the last couple of minutes of the third period, Andrei Burakovsky would get another one for the Avalanche. The Coyotes would not be able to tie it up, and they'd end up losing 3-2, but certainly a big improvement for them over Game 1. Good news for the Avalanche is that even in a game in which they did not play particularly well, they managed to get this win, and they have such immensely skilled players that they're able to get away with something like that. Players like McKinnon, where even if the rest of the team isn't doing good, and even if McKinnon himself may not be doing well, although that was not the case this game necessarily, he's able to just pot in a goal with a great burst of speed, and that's what happened here. The Coyotes just a bit of a miscue early on at the blue line between Kessel, between Taylor Hall, and the Avalanche are able to capitalize on that and get that first goal after a decently slow start in the first couple of minutes. And that's just something the Avalanche can do, and it's something very few teams can really match in the league, as so few teams have elite players like McKinnon or even Rantanen on them. The bad news for the Avalanche is the fact that, you know, it's not necessarily massive bad news, but it is that they didn't play particularly well this game. They really let the Coyotes come alive in this series, and if maybe these two teams were a bit more evenly matched, this could be much worse news for the Avalanche. But because they are seemingly quite ahead of the Coyotes just in terms of play and in terms of just level, it's probably not going to bite them, but it's still not a great thing to sort of just lean back a bit here in this series. On to the good news for the Coyotes. As I said, they played a pretty prideful game. They really looked much better than they did in the previous game. It was very easy. It would have been very easy for them to sort of just roll over and die in this series. They had proven a lot by taking out the Nashville Predators in the play-in rounds, and now they were facing off against, you could say, a juggernaut like the Colorado Avalanche, and so losing in 4 games, whatever. But the Coyotes, they really came back, they really played a solid game, and honestly, if a couple of bounces had gone the other which way, they probably could have been victorious in this one and had a tied series. It was unfortunate that that didn't end up being the case, but credit to the Coyotes where they deserve it. The bad news is that this was a poorly played game by the Avalanche. The Coyotes were able to try and take advantage of that, and yet they still lost this game, and it's very likely that this is going to end up being the Avalanche's worst game of the series. I suspect they'll be much better for Game 3, and with the fact that the Coyotes couldn't even get a victory in what will likely be the Avalanche's worst game of the series is not necessarily a great thing. So I don't know how much of a chance the Coyotes still actually have, but it was still nice to see them play pretty well here in Game 2. On to the next one, which was Canadiens versus Flyers. And at the end of the first Canadiens game between these two teams, I had said that the Canadiens were looking pretty decent. They were really bringing it to the Flyers. They were competitive with that team, and at the moment they were playing with house money. I had put it in that they had already proven the sort of naysayers wrong by taking out the Pittsburgh Penguins, and so it was all sort of just gold the rest of the way. But they come out here in Game 2, and they win it 5-0, a dominant performance by the Canadiens. Their coach, Claude Julien, had some health issues. He had to leave the bubble, if I'm not mistaken, so he won't be out. He won't be here for at least the rest of the series. Kirk Muller comes in, and he does a fantastic job. The Canadiens do a fantastic job in just a complete dominant performance over the Philadelphia Flyers with the 5-0 victory. And now this series is a lot more interesting than it had been just a couple of days ago. It starts off Tatar getting that first goal, getting on the score sheet for himself, Kotkaniemi, then Tatar again, then it would be I believe it would be Armia and then Kotkaniemi once more to finish off the 5-0 victory for the Canadiens. Just so much good in terms of good news. I think one big thing is something that I pointed out as being a bit bad for the Canadiens was that their top players weren't necessarily performing all that well, and they were relying on a bit more depth scoring, but Tatar comes up with a couple of goals here, a couple of assists for Max Domi, Gallagher getting on the board as well with a point or two, and so That's a great thing for the Canadiens. Price continues to be extremely strong during these playoffs thus far, and so a lot of good for the Canadiens. And it's hard to really point out bad news after a game like this. Honestly, if you were to interview the Flyers coach, for instance, it's one of those games where you just can't really take much, the Canadiens coach, for instance, it's one of those games where it's hard to really point out much bad about it. This is just a great game for the Canadiens, a great ability to tie up this series and put themselves in a position to potentially upset once more and move on to the second round. For the Flyers, this is not really much good news for this situation. I don't think this necessarily puts them in a terrible position in this series because they did win game 1. I doubt they'll end up getting shut out 5-0 again in this series. It's just one of those, you move past it. You really have to in a best of 7 series. If you get destroyed like this, you have to be able to move past it, because if you linger too much on this game, the series will absolutely get away from you. You're almost guaranteed to lose at that point if you linger on a loss like this. So you move past it, you move on, you play better for next game. So not much good news. The bad news would be, of course, that the Flyers still can't seem to figure out this way to solve Carey Price. Just 2 goals in these 2 games. The defense was quite spotty throughout this game, not really doing a great job of clearing in front of the net. And Carter Hart, who had been great in the game 1, ends up getting pulled here in game 2. I wouldn't necessarily put all of these goals on him. He led in the first 4. The 5th one was led in by fill-in Brian Elliott, but he probably could have still been better. So not great here for the Philadelphia Flyers, but fantastic for the Montreal Canadiens. The next series of the day was Blues versus Canucks. The Canucks would end up winning and taking the 2-0 lead with a 4-3 overtime victory. The Canucks would come out to a pretty solid lead. It would be Horvat and Pearson to get the 2-0. It would be cut into by O'Reilly before Pettersson would make it 3-1 Canucks. However, the Blues would be able to get a goal from Blais to bring it within 1. And then late in the game, David Perron in just the last few seconds would tie it up and we would force overtime. But in said overtime, it would be once again Bo Horvat for the Canucks finishing off and putting themselves in a commanding position to try and finish off this series and eliminate the previous year's Stanley Cup champion. Good news for the Vancouver Canucks. One big thing is, of course, Markstrom, who was very good in this game, certainly. But another one is something I've mentioned before. I don't think there's a team at the moment in the playoffs who are getting a better performance from their top players. Bo Horvat has maybe been the best forward in the play-ins and /playoffs thus far. He's been absolutely lights out for the Vancouver Canucks. Players like Pettersson as well. Pearson has stepped up quite strongly here for the Canucks. And so they're getting very timely and very, very good offense from their players. And of course, great goaltending from Markstrom. The only bad news is that in this situation here for the Canucks, while they're getting those goals, it's coming on not that many opportunities. They have only hit more than 30 shots once thus far in the 6 games they have played. That was an overtime game against the Minnesota Wild, and that was a 31-shot performance. Otherwise, against the Wild, they were getting high 20s. Here against the Blues, they're getting even low 20s in terms of shots, and it's still working out. They're still scoring goals here, and that's because of these top players just really capitalizing heavily on their opportunities. But it may or may not actually be necessarily a recipe for success. If the Blues really pull things together here and start to shut down things a bit more, the Canucks are probably going to work not to get better opportunities, but to get more of those opportunities, because eventually they're going to stop going in. I guess I should say that's most likely what's going to happen. For the good news for the Blues, this wasn't an awfully played game. They ended up managing to tie this game up to force that overtime, even though they ended up losing. They're getting some goals here. It's not the worst thing in the world for the St. Louis Blues. The major problem, of course, is that they're now down 2-0 in this series, but they are a resilient team. We know they have a lot of heart, and while they haven't necessarily looked super engaged thus far through these first couple of games, it feels as though they felt like they could maybe just coast through this series. I do have faith in a team like the St. Louis Blues that they'll be able to potentially stage some sort of comeback here, at least put up a good fight in these last few games of this series. The main bad news for the St. Louis Blues is, again, I have to look at Jordan Binnington in net. I think a play that really perfectly encapsulated what is happening in this series between these two goaltenders is what happened in overtime. At one end in the Canucks zone, Jacob Markstrom making multiple miraculous saves on a specific stretch that was really scrambling there for the Canucks defensemen and forwards, and yet Markstrom keeps them alive, and then eventually it goes the other way. Bo Horvat in on this breakaway. You're hoping that Jordan Binnington can make the big save for them and keep the Blues alive in the overtime like Markstrom had just done, and yet it's just not there. It's one of those criticisms that I've had multiple times this season for Martin Jones, where you hope that your goaltender can make a big save, and Binnington thus far in this series, the first couple of games, he just has not been doing that at all for the Blues. He looks like a completely different player than what he was last season during the playoffs, and the Blues will, if they are going to come back in the series, it's not just going to take that resiliency and that heart, but they're going to need some much more improved play from their goaltender and maybe a stolen game or two. The next series was Capitals versus Islanders. The Islanders had the 1-0 series lead, and they would expand that to a 2-0 series lead with this 5-2 victory. And it started off quite well for the Capitals. They scored the first goal of the game within the first minute from Ovechkin. He had gotten activated now in this series, and it was looking pretty good through the first few minutes. But the Islanders do as the Islanders do. They get a goal there from Leddy, another one from Matt Martin. It's quickly responded to by another from Ovechkin, but then quickly responded to again by one from Nelson. And once that 3-2 lead was in for the Islanders, they seemingly just shut it down. Eventually, they'd get a Clutterbuck goal late in the third period, and eventually then a Anders Lee empty netter. But in the end, it's just a victory for the Islanders and a 2-0 series lead, and the Capitals are sort of looking at a loss at this point in this series. The good news for the Islanders is, well, their defense remains just completely fantastic. Maybe one of the best defenses here that we've seen in the playoffs and in the play-ins. They're not the best team on paper for sure, which is why so many people are used to underestimating a team like the Islanders, but they have proven time and time again, especially against these really skilled teams that are usually just outplaying opponents, that they're able to just stifle them and prevent them from doing much of anything in the games that they do play. The bad news for the Islanders, right now, they've scored a bunch of goals here in these past couple of games. I think at the moment they're getting not lucky bounces per se, but a lot of their opportunities are going in, which is probably something that's going to dry up at least slightly. And in the case, they're still giving up a couple of goals here to the Capitals per game. So it's possible these games get a lot closer as we move on in this series if that Islanders offensive well dries up. But usually for the Islanders, that defense, the play of their defense is usually able to cover up that small issue, which is that offense that isn't necessarily all that good at all the time. On the Capitals side, I guess the good news would be is that they have scored a couple of goals in each of these games, which is not normally good news to be able to just score 2 goals in a specific game, but against the Islanders, that's actually more than what a lot of teams actually managed to put up. You take a look at the Florida Panthers in their series in the play-ins, they only actually managed to score more than 2 goals once in the 4 games, and so the Capitals doing it twice in a row. And it should also be pointed out there have been, whether they've been pretty slight, certainly, but there have been moments in both of these first couple of games in which the Capitals have been able to run around the Islanders. It just has not nearly been that consistent. The Islanders have seemingly always been able to close those gaps, and the Capitals haven't been able to take enough of an advantage in that area. In terms of the bad news, when the Capitals aren't really rolling well in these games, they seemingly are just getting completely shut down by the Islanders, looking completely lost, and it just doesn't really look like they're able to generate much of anything, and they look sort of just lifeless, honestly. Late in this third period, up 3-2 the Islanders are. The fact that they're able to just keep the puck in the zone against the Capitals for so long, and the Capitals are seemingly just unable to do anything about it, is not a great look for the Capitals, and it's almost looking like they may end up going the same way as the Pittsburgh Penguins did last season when they faced the Islanders in the first round, having gotten swept. There's still hope for the Capitals, only because they've only lost 2 games thus far, but it's not looking great. And the final game of the day was Flames versus Stars, the first game 3 of round 1, because they are playing this back-to-back. And this was a game that the Flames, they came back after losing a very disappointing 5-4 game, and they get a 2-0 shutout, which was nice for them to take the 2-1 series lead. Goals from Backlund as well as TJ Brody. to win it 2-0. Good news for the Calgary Flames, and this is something that I would really want to point out. It's a strong coaching move from their coach, Ward. It's something that we have not seen really at all thus far in these playoffs. Normally, in the playoffs, when you have two capable goaltenders, it seems this year, when one has a bad game, you go with the other. I mean, just looking at the team they're against, the Dallas Stars, in Game 1, they went with Khudobin. He didn't play particularly well, so in Game 2, they went with Ben Bishop, who again didn't play particularly well, and Game 3, they were right back with Anton Khudobin. You take a look at the Carolina Hurricanes, Game 1 against the Boston Bruins, they went with Peter Mrazek, didn't go particularly well, they moved on to James Reimer. But here, Game 2, Cam Talbot played, he let in 5 goals, it wasn't a particularly strong game for Cam Talbot, and Jeff Ward, coach for the Flames, had all the opportunities in the world to just decide to go with David Rittich for this next game, have him play, and see it couldn't be much worse than the 5 goals that Talbot let in. But instead, he sticks with Talbot, he has faith in him, and he is rewarded with this shutout victory. Talbot looked very good in this game, so a great coaching move from the Flames. The bad news is that even though this was a victory for the Flames, you know, they gave up a lot of opportunities. They're probably quite lucky to have actually escaped with this victory. They're very lucky that the Stars actually didn't manage to score a single goal at all. You would not have suspected this final score like this if you were actually watching the game. And so the Flames, you know, Talbot played well, but they really escaped here with the victory, which in the playoffs, a victory is a victory, a W is a W, but still, it's not necessarily a recipe for success. And that brings us to the good news for the Stars, which is exactly that. They didn't manage to replicate their offensive output from the previous game, but they did manage to almost replicate the amount of pressure they still managed to put on offensively, just again stifled by Talbot multiple times, and also just the bad bounces for them. I mean, early on in this game, you have Tyler Seguin, he hits the crossbar, the goal lights go on, people think this is a goal that passes the goal line, but it's not. It bounces off the crossbar, comes straight to Radulov, he goes for the rebound, and he somehow shoots it across the crease and misses the net. And this ended up being the story for the entire game for the Stars. But the good news, they got the chances. The bad news, they couldn't convert. The other bad news, of course, would be they went back with Khudobin in this game. And I don't think he was particularly bad. So I guess it's not necessarily the worst news. But it is still this problem that I've mentioned time and time again of bouncing between these goaltenders. They'll probably go with Khudobin again in Game 4, but I don't know how well that's going to stick. But that will do it for this recap. In terms of my predictions, the first one, I had the Avalanche in 5 games. Based on how the Coyotes looked in this one, it's possible that they can manage to sneak a game here, so I'm looking pretty strong on that prediction. Then for the Flyers in 5 games, considering the play of the Canadiens in this game, that doesn't look quite good. I haven't given up on the Flyers winning the series thus far, but 5 games is a bit of a long shot at this point. Then for the Blues Canucks, I have the Blues in 6. It's possible, but seemingly quite unlikely at this point that does occur. The Capitals, the Islanders, I have the Capitals in 7. Again, that is possible, but also quite unlikely that it occurs. And then in the Flames Stars, I have the Stars in 7, and I'm still holding out hope for that one just based on how this game went, even though the Flames won the game. Class dismissed.